Welcome to a story that reveals the devastating collision of human courage and unstoppable industrial power. Imagine a sky on August 17, 1943, where a lone German pilot gazes up at an endless silver glacier, 376 Boeing B-17 bombers, gleaming, heavily armed, flying in perfect harmony, ready to crush everything in their path. These aircraft, bristling with over 1,000 machine guns, stretch from Schweinfurt to Regensburg, a testament to American industrial might. But what if I told you that just 40 German fighters faced this colossal force, an odds so staggering it once would have been dismissed as propaganda? How could a handful of pilots hope to stand against such an overwhelming tide? What if the very sky that once belonged to German fighters was now a battleground for a relentless, unstoppable machine? And what does this say about the true nature of victory? Does heroism suffice when the war is decided by mass production, technological dominance, and sheer numbers? Today we will uncover how the rapid escalation of American bombing campaigns in industrial capacity transformed the air war between 1943 and 1945, crushing the myth of German aerial supremacy and turning the skies into a battlefield of systemic, mathematical power. We'll explore the strategic targets, factories producing nearly one-third of all German fighters, vital components like ball bearings, whose destruction aimed to cripple the very core of German war effort. We'll witness the desperate innovations of German pilots dropping bombs from fighters, their daring attempts to challenge an industrial juggernaut that seemed unstoppable. And we'll see the tragic toll: veteran pilots shot down in numbers that could never be replaced, entire units decimated, as the relentless superiority of Allied aircraft, from P-51 Mustangs to B-17 Flying Fortresses, reshaped the sky into a domain of overwhelming material force. But this isn't just a story of equipment and tactics. It's a profound lesson about the nature of warfare itself. How did the legendary fighters and aces of the past give way to a brutal, impersonal machine, where victory no longer depended on individual heroism, but on the relentless output of factories and the cold calculus of logistics? Can courage alone defy a system built on mass production? As the German Air Force was reduced to a shadow of itself, grounded by fuel shortages, overwhelmed by numbers, what did the pilots' own testimonies reveal about the tragic evolution from dominance to defeat? How did the moral and strategic collapse of Germany's once mighty Luftwaffe reflect a broader truth: that modern warfare is dictated not by daring or skill, but by the unyielding, unstoppable machinery of industrial scale? This is the story of a sky transformed from a battlefield of daring to a theater of systemic mathematical power, where victory is written not in courage alone, but in the relentless, impersonal output of resources and technology. The question remains: when the sky is saturated with uncountable metal, can individual bravery still make a difference? Or has the very concept of victory been redefined forever? On the ominous morning of August 17th in the year 1943, high above the German town of Schweinfurt, at an altitude of 25,000 feet, a chilling scene unfolded that would become etched in the annals of aerial warfare. As the cold, unforgiving air descended upon him, the oxygen mask of the German pilot, Heinzko, froze rigid against his face, a stark testament to the harsh conditions that encased the sky. Through the canopy of his aircraft, he gazed upon a sight so extraordinary and overwhelming that it challenged human comprehension. The skies, which once had belonged predominantly to German fighters, were now filled with an enormous, seemingly endless formation of American bombers, an aerial armada of unprecedented scale. This formidable sight was composed of the legendary Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, a fleet of 376 of these immense aircraft, which stretched from the town of Schweinfurt to Regensburg like a colossal silver glacier advancing across the heavens. Their polished exteriors gleamed brilliantly in the morning sunlight, reflecting blinding sheets of light that danced across the sky, creating a spectacle both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Each of these bombers was heavily armed, bristling with more than 1,300 caliber machine guns, designed to ward off any attacking fighters with deadly precision. The formation was meticulously arranged in combat boxes, tight, disciplined groups flying in perfect harmony, forming interlocking fields of fire capable of unleashing devastating walls of lead upon any enemy daring to approach. Amidst this overwhelming display of American industrial might, the German pilots, including Enoch's Jag-Geschwader 11, along with elements from Jag-Geschwader 1 and Jag-Geschwader 26, faced a mathematical reality that mocked human courage and skill. In this moment, 40 German fighters confronted an armada of hundreds of American aircraft, a disparity so staggering that it would have been dismissed as mere propaganda just a few months earlier. Yet by this point in the war, such odds had become the grim, daily reality for Luftwaffe pilots tasked with defending the skies of the Reich. What Kanoki and his fellow pilots observed that morning was not merely an air raid. It was a visual, living demonstration of American industrial supremacy, an unstoppable force that would, in due course, threaten to drown the very foundations of the Third Reich. The rapid evolution from German aerial dominance to near-total destruction had occurred with astonishing speed between the years of 1943 and 1944. The transformation was so profound that many German pilots would later describe it as feeling like their world was being turned upside down in a matter of months. By mid-1943, the scope and scale of American bombing campaigns had escalated to levels that German military strategists had never even envisioned. The mission over Schweinfurt in Regensburg on that day, officially designated as Mission 84, marked a pivotal point in strategic bombing. Colonel Curtis Lame, commanding the 4th Bombardment Wing of the United States Army Air Forces, led a force of 146 B-17 bombers targeting the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. Simultaneously, 230 bombers from the 1st Bombardment Wing struck the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. These targets were far from random. They were carefully selected for their critical importance to the German war effort. Ball bearings, in particular, had been identified as a crucial bottleneck in German military production, essential for the assembly of tanks, vehicles, and aircraft. The Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg was responsible for manufacturing nearly one-third of all German single-engine fighters, a vital component of the Luftwaffe's aerial capabilities. The strategic objective was unmistakable: to cripple Germany's ability to produce fighters and to weaken its overall war production by disrupting the supply of vital components such as ball bearings. German fighter commander Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most revered and experienced leaders, had desperately scrambled every available aircraft to confront the relentless assault. JG-1 Usau was launched from Dan and Schiphol airfields, while JG-11 took off from Yei and Oldenburg, and JG-26 Schlegata from Leyla and Uvelgum. These elite units of the Luftwaffe, decorated with Knight's Crosses and oak leaves, men who had once dominated the skies over France, Britain, and Russia, now faced odds so overwhelming that their skill and bravery seemed almost meaningless in the face of such industrial and numerical superiority. The German pilots, many of whom had previously flown with distinction in various theaters of the war, found themselves confronting a new and terrifying reality, one in which their traditional tactics and grit appeared insufficient against the relentless might of American production and technology. The skies that once had belonged to German fighters, symbols of national pride and military prowess, were now increasingly dominated by an enemy that wielded an almost inexhaustible supply of aircraft, armaments, and strategic resources. German pilots, desperate to counter the overwhelming American air power, developed increasingly risky and innovative tactics to break through the formidable bomber formations. Among these was the pioneering technique of dropping bombs from fighters directly onto the enemy aircraft from above, a method that no pilot had previously attempted on such a scale. The first successful execution of this daring approach was achieved by a pilot named No himself on March 22, 1943. He managed to destroy a Boeing B-17 flying fortress using this method, thereby earning the distinction of being the first aviator in aviation history to down an enemy aircraft with an air-dropped bomb. In his memoir titled I Flew for the Führer, No himself described these attacks as highly experimental, emphasizing his unwavering determination to discover new tactics capable of disrupting the tightly knit defensive boxes that the American bombers formed. These innovations, however, proved to be mere pinpricks against the relentless and growing American aerial presence. By October the 14th, 1943, an infamous day known as Black Thursday, The situation had become even more dire for the German Luftwaffe. During the second raid on Schweinfurt, nearly 391 B-17 bombers crossed into German airspace, threatening to devastate the already strained defenses. In what would be remembered as one of the Luftwaffe's last significant collective defensive efforts, over 300 fighters were scrambled from 24 different airfields. Among these fighters, Major Heinz Beer's second Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 1, known by its nickname Focke-Wulf, launched with their formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190s, each armed with the new and deadly WGR-21 rockets. Meanwhile, Jagdgeschwader 11, distinguished by their yellow Reich defense bands that set them apart from JG-1's red markings, also engaged fiercely in the battle. Despite the intense German effort, they achieved what appeared to be a tactical victory, shooting down 60 American bombers, which translated to a loss rate of approximately 20.6%, a figure so significant that it forced the Americans to temporarily suspend their deep penetration raids into Germany. Yet this hard-won success came at an enormous cost to the Luftwaffe. Approximately 35 to 38 fighters were lost, including many veteran pilots whose experience was irreplaceable. Among the fallen was Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, the younger brother of the renowned Adolf Galland, who was killed when his FW-190 was struck by defensive fire. These men represented hundreds of hours of combat expertise that Germany could never replace. Each B-17G flying fortress was a marvel of defensive engineering, outfitted with powerful armor and a comprehensive array of machine guns positioned to cover all angles. The tactical formation known as the combat box, consisting of 18 to 21 aircraft flying in close mutual support, was designed to unleash devastating firepower against attacking fighters. This formation was a product of bloody, hard-earned experience, making frontal assaults nearly suicidal and beam attacks fraught with danger. German fighters, for their part, boasted excellent individual capabilities. Aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109G6 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A4 were among the finest fighters of the war. However, reaching the American bombers had become increasingly difficult, especially with the advent of long-range escort fighters. The introduction of the P-47 Thunderbolt with drop tanks extended American fighter escort ranges deep into German territory by late 1943. By March of 1944, when P-51 Mustangs began appearing over Berlin itself, German fighters found themselves fighting for survival even before they could reach the bomber streams. This escalating desperation among German pilots and commanders fostered remarkable and often reckless innovations. One such tactic was the Sturmgruppe concept, involving specially armored FW-190 fighters that would close in on the bombers at point-blank range before unleashing devastating fire with their 30mm cannons. These aircraft were heavily reinforced to withstand the intense damage inflicted during such close encounters. When their ammunition was exhausted, pilots were sometimes expected to ram the bombers with their fighters, a tactic requiring extraordinary courage and determination. These Sturmrucker attacks involved flying reinforced fighters directly through the dense bomber formations, sometimes literally chopping wings or tails with their propellers in a desperate attempt to cause chaos and destruction from within. The story of Germany's elite fighter units encapsulates this evolution in tactics and the tragic decline of German air power. For instance, the unit known as Jagdgeschwader exemplified this turbulent period. As the war progressed, the experience and skill of these units diminished rapidly due to relentless losses and inadequate replacements. The death of Walter Ossau, a highly decorated ace with over 127 confirmed victories, marked a poignant moment. He was shot down by P-38 Lightnings on May the 11th, 1944. His death symbolized the grim fate awaiting even the most accomplished German pilots. Between the loss of Major Hans Phillips, who had achieved a staggering 124,000 barrels of fuel daily in early 1944, which supplied approximately 92% of all aviation fuel needed for German aircraft. These vital facilities, the heart of Germany's synthetic fuel industry, became primary targets for Allied strategic bombing campaigns starting in May of that year. On May the 12th, 1944, a massive assault involving nearly 1,000 bombers struck these crucial oil production sites. The immediate consequence was devastating. The output of synthetic fuel plummeted from an impressive 175,000 tons in the month of April to just over 52,000 tons in June, further declining to approximately 35,000 tons in July, and finally dwindling to a mere 5,000 tons by September. The impact was catastrophic. In July, reports indicated that approximately 98% of all Axis fuel plants had ceased operation. This irony was bitterly cruel. While Germany's aircraft manufacturing industry reached unprecedented levels, producing an astonishing 39 1,877 aircraft in the year 1944, including nearly 25,000 fighters, these planes sat idle on the ground, starved of fuel to power their engines, and without enough trained pilots to operate them. The fuel shortages became so severe that ground crews resorted to using oxen to move aircraft across airfields, conserving the dwindling supplies of fuel. By November of 1944, all training flights were suspended entirely as fuel supplies dwindled to only 10% of the minimum required for operations. Most pilots could perform only a single training sortie per month, and by February of the following year, synthetic fuel production had fallen to a fraction, about 0.5%, of what it had been in early 1944. The psychological toll on German fighter pilots was profound. Veterans who had entered the war with confidence and determination gradually transformed into fatalistic survivors, fully aware that their chances of survival were rapidly diminishing. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most accomplished aces, with a total of 176 victories, vividly described this tragic shift in his memoirs. He recounted how, in 1940, they regarded themselves as hunters, confident and dominant in the skies. By 1943, they felt they shared the airspace with the enemy, and by 1944, they found themselves simply trying to survive amid relentless destruction. As the supply of fuel and trained pilots continued to dwindle, the once formidable German Air Force was increasingly unable to mount effective defenses or offensive operations. The loss of experienced pilots, combined with the inability to replace them, accelerated the collapse of the Luftwaffe's fighting capability, turning what had once been a symbol of German aerial prowess into a shadow of its former self. In the early months of the year 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel industry was still producing approximately 124,000 barrels of aviation fuel every single day, a staggering figure that accounted for an overwhelming 92% of the Luftwaffe's total aviation fuel supply. These vital fuel production facilities had become prime targets for Allied bombing campaigns, especially starting in May of that year, when strategic efforts intensified to cripple Germany's war machinery at its very core. On the 12th of May, 1944, a massive force of 935 Allied bombers launched a relentless attack on these crucial synthetic oil plants, aiming to deliver a crushing blow to Germany's ability to sustain its air war effort. The immediate consequences of this assault were devastating and far-reaching. The production of synthetic fuel plummeted dramatically, dropping from an impressive 175,000 tons in April to just over 52,000 tons in June. By July, output had further declined to approximately 35,000 tons, and by September, it had dwindled to a mere 5,000 tons, an almost complete collapse of the fuel supply chain. The renowned German journalist and military observer Albert Scharr reported in July that an astonishing 98% of all Axis fuel plants were rendered inoperative, effectively bringing Germany's fuel production to the brink of total destruction. Ironically, despite this catastrophic loss of fuel, the German aircraft industry was paradoxically reaching unprecedented heights. In the year 1944, German aircraft manufacturing hit an all-time high, with a total of 39,870 aircraft produced, including a staggering 24,981 fighters. The peak monthly fighter production occurred in September of that year, reaching a figure of 3,310 fighters. Yet this apparent industrial triumph was fundamentally hollow, as the vast majority of these aircraft remained grounded, rendered useless by the severe shortages of fuel and trained pilots capable of operating them. The ground crews of the Luftwaffe, in an effort to conserve what little fuel remained, resorted to extraordinary measures, such as using oxen to move aircraft across airfields, instead of relying on engines and motors. By November of 1944, the situation had deteriorated so rapidly that all pilot training flights were altogether suspended, leaving the fighters to operate on a mere 10% of the minimum fuel necessary for effective combat. Pilots were now restricted to just one training flight per month, and by the beginning of February 1945, synthetic fuel production had collapsed to a fraction, specifically a mere half of 1%, of the levels recorded in early 1944. This relentless depletion of fuel and resources inflicted profound psychological damage on the German fighter pilots, often preceding their physical destruction in combat. Men who had entered the war confident, proud, and eager to face the enemy gradually transformed into resigned, fatalistic survivors. Acutely aware that their chances of victory had all but vanished, the renowned German fighter pilot Johannes Steinhoff vividly documented this tragic evolution in his memoirs. In 1940, he recalled, "We were hunters, eager and confident, soaring the skies with purpose and skill. By 1943, that confidence had eroded into a sense of being hunted, and by 1944, the pilots saw themselves merely as targets, vulnerable and expendable." Steinhoff described how the creeping realization that the war was already lost spread like wildfire through the fighter units, with many recognizing that their leaders had abandoned every standard of responsible military conduct. The culmination of this despair and disillusionment manifested in the infamous fighter pilots' revolt on the 22nd of January, 1945. This mutiny was led by some of Germany's most decorated and esteemed aces, including Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, Galuzzo, and Hannes Trautloff. They confronted Hermann Göring at his residence in Berlin, demanding action and accountability. This unprecedented insubordination by the elite pilots symbolized the complete breakdown of trust and cohesion between those on the front lines and their commanders. The pilots laid out their grievances plainly. Accusations of cowardice despite facing impossible odds, frustration with what they perceived as grossly incompetent operational leadership, and the controversial dismissal of Galland from his position as General of Fighters. In a direct and candid confrontation, Steinhoff urged Göring to authorize the immediate deployment of the new Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters against the American bombers, arguing that only the jets could effectively challenge the overwhelming air superiority of the Allies. Göring's response was shocking. He accused the pilots of treason and threatened their execution, revealing a profound disconnection from reality. When the pilots presented wreckage of P-51 Mustangs shot down over German territory, a clear sign of Allied air dominance, which Göring dismissed as impossible, claiming the aircraft must have glided in from outside German airspace, the disconnect became painfully evident. Instead of punishing the mutineers, Göring chose to dismiss them. Galland was removed from his post, while Lutzow was. The relentless onslaught continued with the Germans dropping an astonishing 10,000 tons of bombs on key aircraft manufacturing facilities in a single assault. On February the 20th, the American Air Force launched a formidable attack involving approximately 1,030 bombers, each escorted by around 835 fighters, targeting multiple cities across Germany. The German Luftwaffe could only muster a fragmented and disorganized resistance, perhaps totaling around 150 fighters at best, an insufficient number to challenge the overwhelming aerial force descending upon them. Captain He Koka, who by this time had been promoted to Staffelkapitän of the 5th Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 11, vividly recorded the grim reality of that day. His report was stark. They had taken off with merely 8 aircraft, but 2 of these had to abort their missions due to engine failures even before reaching the combat zone. The remaining 6 engaged the enemy, yet only 2 managed to return safely to base. The sky was filled with American P-51 Mustangs, their sleek silhouettes cutting through the clouds in relentless pursuit of German aircraft. By the end of that brutal week, the losses inflicted upon the Luftwaffe were staggering. Around 262 fighters had been shot down, and roughly 100 veteran pilots had been killed in action. Among those who perished was the renowned Major Kurt Euben, a holder of the prestigious Knight's Cross with a tally of 110 enemy aircraft confirmed destroyed. The American losses, while significant, 226 bombers and 28 fighters, were quickly replenished as the industrial capacity of the United States allowed for rapid replacement of aircraft and personnel. This period, often called the Big Week, decisively demonstrated that American fighters now dominated the skies over Germany. Their superiority was unambiguous, and the once formidable German air defenses were now reduced to a patchwork of fragmented resistance that could hardly match the scale and precision of the Allied onslaught. By March the 6th of the year 1944, the psychological fabric of the German air war was irrevocably torn. On that day, a massive daylight raid, comprising approximately 730 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, hammered Berlin, escorted by a formidable force of around 800 fighters, including the iconic P-51 Mustangs. For German pilots, witnessing American fighters flying over the Reich's capital shattered the last vestiges of illusion regarding their air superiority. The Luftwaffe launched a total of 83 sorties against this colossal attack. Yet the results were painfully predictable. Heavy losses for the Germans with minimal strategic impact. German pilots watched helplessly as their capital burned beneath the skies, unable to mount an effective defense. Adolf Galland, one of the most illustrious German aces, later reflected on that day, stating, "March the 6th of the year 1944 marked the moment I realized beyond any doubt that the war was lost. Not because Berlin had been bombed before, but because this time it was bombed in daylight, with the Americans losing less than 5% of their attacking force, while we suffered a loss rate of 30%. The memoirs of the Luftwaffe's most distinguished aces offer intimate and poignant testimony to this tragic journey from dominance to defeat. These men, the elite of German aerial warfare, holders of Knight's Crosses and oak leaves, who had once ruled the skies over France, Britain, and Russia, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer material superiority of their enemies. Adolf Galland, in his memoirs, famously wrote that the essence of a fighter pilot's skill was in attacking, tracking, hunting, and destroying the enemy. He emphasized that confining a pilot to narrow, predictable tasks robbed him of his initiative, and thus the qualities that defined his very essence. His aggressive spirit, his joy in action, and his instinct as a hunter were systematically stripped away by the constraints of their dire circumstances. Johannes Steinhoff, who had flown nearly 1,000 combat missions, wrote somberly about the moral and strategic collapse, stating, "By the time these events unfolded, the leadership of the Reich had abandoned every standard of responsible action, both towards their own people and towards the enemy. The fighter pilots found themselves caught in the middle of this madness, fighting a losing battle with diminishing hope." The evolution of the German fighter pilot's mindset was particularly striking. Early in the war, Heinz Knoke had expressed a naive optimism, writing, "The prospect of actually experiencing war rather appeals to me." However, by the year 1944, his tone had shifted dramatically, reflecting the hopelessness and futility of their situation. His words conveyed a sense of despair, acknowledging that continued resistance was increasingly pointless against the overwhelming numerical and technological superiority of the Allied forces. Major Heinz Baer, who concluded the war with an impressive tally of 221 aerial victories, recounted the transformation of the German air war over British and Soviet aircraft numbers. The disparity became even more glaring, creating a chasm that was impossible for Germany to bridge. This overwhelming imbalance in production capacity, coupled with strategic failures, spelled the inevitable doom of the Luftwaffe's once formidable air power, transforming the skies from a battlefield of skill and daring into one of relentless material superiority. Despite the Germans' technological advancements, such as the introduction of the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt E-262, its potential was rendered largely ineffective by a series of strategic blunders and logistical constraints. The E-262, capable of reaching speeds of approximately 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter, should have revolutionized aerial combat and tipped the balance back in Germany's favor. In reality, it was hamstrung by Hitler's unwavering insistence on deploying these aircraft as bombers rather than fighters, which delayed their operational deployment until the very end of the war, in late 1944. When the legendary German ace Adolf Galland finally demonstrated the capabilities of the Me-262 to Hitler, his exclamation was one of awe. "It felt as though angels were pushing," he famously remarked, highlighting the aircraft's immense potential. Yet Hitler's primary concern was not the aircraft's speed or combat prowess, but its bomb capacity, a narrow-minded focus that disregarded the strategic importance of air superiority. Even after the fighter versions of the Me-262 were authorized, the realities of war, fuel shortages, inadequate training, and production delays severely limited their deployment. The unit Jagdgeschwader 7 could rarely field more than 30 of these advanced fighters at the same time, and against the massive Allied air raids involving thousands of aircraft, even such revolutionary technology failed to turn the tide. The invasion of Normandy on June the 6th in the year of 1944 marked a definitive moment, the complete collapse of the Luftwaffe's capacity to defend the German homeland. Despite years of preparation for the anticipated Allied invasion, the German Air Force could muster only 100 operational fighters on D-Day, a figure woefully insufficient against the overwhelming force of 11,590 sorties launched by the Allies. The Luftwaffe managed a total of only 319 sorties during the entire day, with merely 35 of those conducted by fighters, an utterly ineffective response to the most significant amphibious assault in history. Isef Priller, the commander of JG-26, later recalled the futility of their efforts. Attack the invasion with 2 fighters. It was insane. Days before the invasion, the entire unit had been relocated, leaving only Priller and his wingman, Heinz Wojciech, at Lille. When ordered to attack the invasion beaches, Priller described their actions as almost pointless. They made one strafing pass over Sword Beach before fleeing. This was effectively the Luftwaffe's daylight response to the greatest amphibious landing in history, an utterly inadequate attempt that underscored the hopelessness of their position. The toll on German fighter pilots was catastrophic. Over the course of the war, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 26,800 pilots, either killed or missing. The monthly loss rates in 1944 became unsustainable, with figures such as 16.9% in January, 18.2% in February, and climbing to 21.7% in March. By June, the loss rate had surged to nearly 26%, resulting in a complete turnover of entire units every 4 months. The attrition was so severe that entire flying schools saw their graduates sent directly into death, with some classes suffering 80% casualties within 3 months of training. The attrition was not isolated to trainees. Established units, such as JG-26 under Priller's command, suffered heavy losses. For instance, they lost 58 pilots in the first half of 1944 alone. JG-2 Richthofen lost 67, and JG-11 suffered 73 fatalities, an exodus of experienced combat veterans that Germany could not replace. When Priller assumed command of JG-26 in January of 1943, he had over 23 pilots with more than 100 combat missions each. By June of the following year, that number had dwindled to merely 3, illustrating the rapidly deteriorating state of German air power. German intelligence grossly underestimated American production capabilities. In 1942, they predicted U.S. aircraft output at around 18,000 aircraft for the year, but the actual figure was over 47,836. For 1943, estimates were around 30,000, yet the real production reached over 85,988 aircraft. By 1944, estimates of 50,000 aircraft annually were shattered by the staggering reality of 96,118 aircraft produced. When reports indicated that American fighters alone were being produced at a rate of 3,000 per month, German officials, including Hermann Göring, dismissed these. By the time March of the year 1945 arrived, the once formidable German Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, existing now only in name and official records. The relentless attrition and overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allied forces had rendered it virtually ineffective. Officially, there were more than 1,000 fighter aircraft listed as operational, yet in reality, perhaps only 100 of these could be prepared for combat on any given day. Fuel shortages, which had become a critical limiting factor, allowed each pilot to undertake merely a single sortie per week, a stark indication of the dire logistical situation. Most of these pilots had accumulated less than 50 hours of actual flying time, a dangerously low level of experience considering the intensity of the air war they faced. Heinz Koka, one of the last of Germany's seasoned pilots, took to the skies for his final mission on the 18th of March, 1945. His personal diary vividly captured the bleak reality of that final phase. Aircraft worn and battered from constant use, pilots exhausted both physically and mentally, fuel tanks empty or nearly so, and a crushing awareness that victory was no longer within reach. The cruel mathematics that had been evident since 1943 had finally reached their unavoidable conclusion. Despite the heroic efforts and valiant sacrifices of its pilots, the German Air Force was doomed. Throughout the war, the Luftwaffe had suffered the loss of approximately 76,875 aircraft, of which around 43,000 were destroyed in combat. These figures represent not only material devastation, but also the profound human toll. Approximately 165,000 aircrew members killed, 155,000 wounded, and nearly 192,000 listed as missing or captured. In stark contrast, the United States Army Air Forces, the primary Allied air power, lost around 26,000 airmen killed during the entire conflict, out of a total of over 350,000 personnel who served in its ranks. These losses, though tragic and significant, were sustainable within the context of the immense industrial capacity and logistical support available to the Allies. The disparity in production and resources was simply insurmountable. In the year 1944 alone, the Allies produced a staggering 163,099 aircraft, compared to Germany's mere 39,877. No matter how much courage or skill German pilots displayed, they could not overcome such a vast gap in industrial output. The destruction and decline of the Luftwaffe serve as enduring lessons in the devastating power of industrial warfare. Once considered the most experienced and best-trained air force in the world, German pilots were not defeated solely by a lack of bravery or combat skill, but by the relentless force of mathematical inevitability. The American strategy hinged on mass production, building aircraft in vast quantities, providing adequate training for many pilots, even if it meant accepting high casualty rates. This approach proved superior to Germany's reliance on individual excellence and tactical brilliance. Although German aces scored spectacular victories and earned numerous medals, their personal achievements could not influence the broader strategic outcome dictated by the stark realities of production statistics. When German pilots faced the enormous formations of American bombers and fighters, the stark truth of industrial warfare became undeniable. Individual heroism, no matter how admirable, could not compensate for systemic, technological, and logistical superiority. Between the years 1943 and 1944, German veterans witnessed an unprecedented phenomenon: total airspace dominance achieved through sheer industrial might. Experienced pilots described skies filled with endless columns of silver bombers stretching as far as the eye could see, a metallic flood that symbolized not only military defeat, but the impending end of an era. The swift transition from hunter to hunted was startling. In 1940, German fighters had swept away opposition across the European skies, establishing a reputation for dominance. However, by 1944, they could scarcely defend their own airfields, let alone challenge the relentless onslaught of Allied aircraft. This was not a gradual decline, but a catastrophic collapse, an overwhelming defeat that unfolded with shocking speed. The pilots' revolt of January 1945 marked the final acknowledgement by those who had long refused to accept the reality, an admission that the war was lost. When Germany's most decorated aces, including figures like Adolf Galland, confronted the Luftwaffe's commander Hermann Göring with the stark truth that continuing the fight was pointless and would only lead to pointless death, they voiced what every pilot understood deep down. The lessons learned by these pilots in modern aerial combat were brutal and uncompromising. Individual excellence, no matter how brilliant, cannot triumph over systemic superiority. They flew knowing full well that victory was beyond reach, that their sacrifices would change nothing. Yet they persisted, driven by duty, ingrained habit, or the simple inability to do otherwise. In their collective defeat, profound lessons about the nature of production, power, and the limits of courage emerged. The German pilots of 1943 to 1945 had directly witnessed the transformation of warfare into a brutal mathematical contest, where the outcome was dictated not. In the final analysis, the German fighters who confronted those relentless bomber armadas were not merely defeated in a conventional sense, they became witnesses to a profound and unsettling transformation of warfare itself, one driven by the relentless logic of industrial scale and mathematical inevitability. Their testimonies serve as irrefutable historical evidence of this shift, capturing the stark reality that they fought not just against an enemy, but against an unstoppable, calculated force of production and technology. These pilots engaged in combat with the understanding that victory was increasingly dictated by numbers and machinery rather than individual heroism, skill, or valor. They experienced firsthand how the certainty of defeat was rooted in the overwhelming disparity of material resources, a disparity that rendered personal bravery insufficient against the cold, precise machinery of war. Throughout the years of 1943 to 1945, German fighter pilots learned through bitter, blood-stained lessons that when the skies become saturated with an uncountable multitude of metal, thousands upon thousands of bombers and fighters, the significance of individual prowess diminishes to near insignificance. Their skill, once the defining element of aerial combat, was now subordinate to the crushing weight of industrial capacity, which favored quantity over quality, mass production over individual excellence. The era of the legendary ace, once celebrated as the pinnacle of aerial combat achievement, came to a tragic and inevitable end. It was replaced by the stark reality that victory depended on the relentless, mechanized output of aircraft, weapons, and resources. An age where the sheer volume of material dictated the outcome of battles and ultimately the war itself. This shift marked the dawn of a new epoch in warfare, one characterized by the dominance of mass production, strategic industrialization, and numerical superiority. The individual heroism that had once defined aerial combat was now overshadowed by the formidable, impersonal machinery of modern military industry. The pilots who fought in this era understood this truth painfully and conclusively. Their sacrifices and skills, while still remarkable, could no longer alter the course dictated by the relentless march of industrial might. Their struggles and losses symbolize the profound transformation of warfare from a domain of personal daring to a battlefield of systemic, mathematical power. A transformation that irrevocably changed the nature of combat and the very concept of victory itself.